Don't move. Don't speak. The words cut through the marble lobby of the Blackthorn Grand like a blade through silk, and for one suspended moment nobody in the building breathed. A woman in a charcoal coat stopped mid-stride, her heels frozen an inch above the floor, because the man who had spoken those words was not supposed to have a voice loud enough to stop anyone. He wore a gray janitor's uniform with a faded name patch. He carried a mop that had seen better decades, and he had just ordered the most powerful woman in the city to freeze in place. Celeste Wren turned slowly, the way predators turn, and fixed her eyes on him with the kind of contempt she reserved for people who wasted her time. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, and her voice was quiet in the way that made grown executives sweat through their shirts. He did not answer. He only looked down at the ring on her right hand, then lifted his gaze to meet hers, steady and unafraid, and said that if she stepped into that elevator, she would never learn who was trying to kill her. She went still. Security began moving toward him from both sides of the lobby, radios crackling, but he did not flinch, did not raise his hands, did not do anything a frightened man would do. He simply stood between her and the private elevator like a wall that had decided to grow legs. The rain outside beat against the windows of the Blackthorn Grand in long gray sheets, and inside, the lobby lights burned gold against dark stone, the kind of place built to remind visitors that money had its own gravity. The hotel occupied the top 11 floors of a tower that Renwell Industries had quietly owned for years, a discreet arrangement that allowed its board to hold sensitive meetings far from the eyes of competitors and reporters alike. Celeste Wren was 39 years old, the founder and chief executive of Renwell Industries, a woman whose name alone could move markets before breakfast. She had just come down from a closed-door session with her board, a meeting that had run long and left her jaw tight with the particular exhaustion of managing men who smiled at her and undermined her in the same sentence. Every one of them had voiced concern that evening about the company's rising debt figures, numbers that made no sense to Celeste, no matter how many times her finance team explained them away, and she had left the room with the uneasy feeling that something beneath the surface of her own company had shifted without her permission. She was known throughout the industry for three things: her coldness, her control, and her unwillingness to let anyone see a crack in either. She had built that reputation deliberately, brick by brick, ever since her earliest years in the company, when she had watched how quickly the business world discarded women who allowed themselves to appear uncertain. Nobody had watched Celeste Wren flinch in over a decade, and she intended to keep it that way, even now, even exhausted, even carrying a worry she could not yet name. She wanted nothing more, in that moment, than to reach the sanctuary of her private elevator and disappear upward, away from the noise of the day, away from men who nodded at her ideas in meetings, and quietly reversed them the moment she left the room. Instead, a janitor named Darius Bell had planted himself in her path like a man who had been waiting his entire life for this single, impossible interruption. Darius Bell was 41, a single father, a man who moved through the hotel with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that nobody looks twice at a man pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. For 3 years he had polished these floors, wiped these windows, and said almost nothing to anyone, and in 3 years he had never once drawn attention to himself. He arrived early, left late, kept his uniform pressed, and answered every question from his supervisors with a politeness so consistent that nobody bothered to ask him a second question at all. The other staff liked him well enough, in the distant way people like a colleague they have never truly gotten to know, and none of them could have told a stranger anything meaningful about the quiet man who cleaned the 40th floor. But something had changed the moment Celeste approached the elevator bank. He had looked up sharply, his eyes tracking first to the control panel above the doors, then to the ring on her hand, and finally to the small black eye of a security camera mounted in the ceiling. Something in that sequence had told him everything he needed to know, a pattern he had spent years training himself to notice and had hoped, quietly, he would never have to notice again. He had crossed the lobby in 4 long strides, to place himself between Celeste and the doors before they could open, moving with a speed and certainty that no one who had watched him mop a floor for 3 years would have believed him capable of. "You are a janitor," she said, letting the words land like an insult, because in her world, A man's title was supposed to explain the entire shape of his life. "I am," he agreed, and there was no shame in it. No apology, only the flat certainty of a man who had made peace with being underestimated. "But I also know what you are about to walk into," he added, and something in his voice made two of the security guards slow their approach without quite understanding why. A small mechanical click sounded from somewhere behind the elevator doors, so faint that most people in the lobby would never have noticed it at all. But Darius heard it the way a man hears a gun being cocked in another room. He reached out and pulled Celeste back by the shoulder, an act that would have gotten a stranger arrested on any other night, and the doors slid open a heartbeat later onto an empty car. There was no one inside. But resting on the polished floor of the elevator, catching the gold light like a coin thrown into a well, sat an old pocket watch, its brass casing scratched with age. Celeste looked at it, and the color left her face in a way that no boardroom battle had ever managed to achieve. It was not the presence of the watch that frightened her, but the fact that she recognized it, that some old and buried part of her chest recognized it, because it belonged to a man she had believed dead for 12 years. Darius watched her reaction carefully, reading the shift in her posture the way he read everything, quietly and completely. And then he asked her a question that would unravel the rest of her life. "Do you remember the night 12 years ago?" he said, and the lobby of the Blackthorn Grand suddenly felt very small around her. 12 years earlier, Renwell Industries had nearly come apart at the seams over a scandal that the company's public relations department had spent a decade trying to bury. A chief engineer named Marcus Vale had been accused of stealing proprietary data, sabotaging a critical development project, and selling trade secrets to a rival firm, a betrayal that had cost the company tens of millions of dollars and very nearly its reputation. The official record, closed and sealed, stated that Marcus had died in a car accident shortly after the accusations surfaced, his guilt forever unresolved in the court of public opinion, because the man himself was no longer alive to answer for it. At the time, Celeste had been vice president, young and hungry and desperate, to prove she belonged in the room with men twice her age, and she had led part of the internal investigation herself. She had believed, with the total conviction of someone who needed to believe it, that Marcus Vale was a traitor who deserved exactly the ruin that found him. "Marcus Vale never sold a single secret belonging to this company," Darius said, and the sentence landed in the lobby like a stone dropped into still water. Celeste stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" she demanded, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked just slightly at the edges. Darius did not answer her. He simply bent down, retrieved his mop from where he had set it against the wall, and resumed working as though the conversation had never happened, as though he had not just detonated the foundation of everything she believed about the worst betrayal of her career. But Celeste could not look away from him now. She watched the way his eyes swept the security camera in the corner every few seconds without seeming to. She watched the way he checked the seal on a nearby door with a glance so brief it would have meant nothing to anyone who was not looking for it. She watched him notice a flicker in the lighting panel that no ordinary maintenance worker would have registered at all, and something cold settled into her stomach. The recognition that this man possessed skills that had no business belonging to someone who mopped floors for a living. That night, once she was alone in her penthouse suite, Celeste made a call she would never have admitted to making. She asked her personal assistant to quietly pull the employment file of Darius Bell, expecting nothing more than a routine background check that would explain away her unease. What came back instead unsettled her further. On paper, Darius Bell was almost aggressively ordinary. No notable degree, no criminal record, no prior connection to Renwell Industries of any kind, 3 unremarkable years as a member of the hotel's janitorial staff. But nestled in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable resume sat a gap of nearly 6 years, a stretch of time with no employer, no address, no trace of a man who otherwise seemed to leave no trace at all. "Where were you during those 6 years?" she asked him the following evening, catching him alone near the loading dock where the hotel kept its supply carts. He looked up at her, and for just a moment, something ancient and tired moved behind his eyes. "In a place," he said, "where dead men are not permitted to be found." The ring became the next thread. Celeste could not stop pulling, Darius told her, with the careful economy of a man rationing his own words, that the ring she wore had not always been simple jewelry. It had belonged to her father, and etched into the inner band, so small that a decade of casual wear had never revealed it to her, was a symbol she had never noticed before. That mark, he explained, had once belonged to an internal security division inside Renwell Industries, a unit that had existed quietly enough that most employees, even senior ones, had no idea it had ever been real. Someone, somewhere, was using that ring's design as a kind of signal, a way of identifying who belonged to an old and dangerous circle of trust. Celeste began to understand that the danger circling her was not random. Someone had engineered every part of what was happening to her, down to the jewelry on her own hand. It was around this time that Gideon Cross entered the frame of the story in full, though he had, in truth, never left it. Gideon was 52, the chairman of Renwell's board of directors, a man whose polish and charm had helped Celeste build the company into what it had become. He was the person she trusted most in the organization, the man who had stood beside her through every difficult year, the closest thing to family she had left in the business world. Darius did not trust him for a single second. "Do not trust the man who has stood closest to you the longest," he told her one evening, and Celeste felt something in her chest tighten with a suspicion she did not want to name. "Are you talking about Gideon?" she asked, already knowing the answer, before she finished the question. "I never said his name," Darius replied, and the silence that followed told her everything she needed and nothing she wanted. Not long after, Darius uncovered proof that a hotel technician had tampered with the elevator's control system in the days before the incident, rerouting a safety protocol, just enough to create the opening for what had nearly happened to Celeste. By the time security tried to question the man, he had vanished from the building and from every record that might have led back to him. Celeste realized, with a slow and sickening clarity, that this was not a random act of violence aimed at a wealthy woman who happened to be an easy target. This was a plan, deliberate and patient, aimed specifically at controlling her, and possibly at removing her altogether. That night Darius handed her an old, weathered envelope, its paper soft with age, sealed shut for over a decade. On the outside, in handwriting she recognized immediately, were the words, "For Celeste, if Marcus ever disappears." Her hands were shaking too badly to open it right away. When she finally read the letter the next morning, alone in her office with the door locked, the words rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own company. The letter had been written by Marcus Vale himself, and in it he confessed a suspicion that had apparently followed him to the edge of his own disappearance. Renwell, he wrote, was being manipulated from within by a small circle of senior leadership who had constructed a secret financial framework designed to quietly siphon assets out of the company. They had falsified reports, manufactured fake debts on the books, and were slowly building toward a moment when the company's true owners would have no choice but to sell, cheaply and quietly, into hands that had engineered the entire crisis from the start. Marcus wrote that he had discovered the scheme and intended to expose it publicly, and that he never got the chance, because before he could act, he vanished from the record of the living entirely. She read certain lines 3 and 4 times over, as though repetition might soften what they meant. Marcus had written that he suspected the falsified reports were only the beginning, that whoever was behind the scheme intended eventually to force a sale of the company itself, quietly and legally, to a buyer who would turn out to be nothing more than another face for the same small circle of men. He had written that he feared what would happen to him if he pursued the truth alone, and that he was leaving the letter behind as insurance, a seed planted in case his fears proved justified. Celeste realized, reading it again, that her own father had once harbored the same suspicions about the men closest to him, suspicions he had apparently never lived long enough to prove. She thought of the dinners where her father had grown suddenly quiet, the late nights he spent alone in his study with the door locked, the way he had once told her, half joking, that a company this large could hide an entire second company inside itself if the right people wanted it to. She had dismissed it then as the paranoia of an aging man. She did not dismiss it now. "But why did you have this letter?" she asked Darius later that day, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Marcus gave it to me," he said simply. Who are you? She pressed, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted one more time. Someone he trusted, Darius answered. Then, why, she asked, did you become a janitor? He looked down at his own hands for a long moment before answering, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. Because there are places power cannot see, he told her, and in that moment Celeste began to understand him differently, not as an anonymous man with a mop, but as the only person in her orbit who wanted absolutely nothing from her. That evening she turned the letter over and found something she had missed the first time, a single line scrawled hastily on the back in her father's own hand. If he is still alive, find DB, it read, and Celeste felt the floor tilt beneath her. DB, she whispered, staring at the man across from her with new eyes. Now you know, was all Darius said in reply, and it was enough. What she learned over the following days rebuilt him from the ground up in her mind. Darius had once been a systems security specialist, a man whose expertise had made him valuable to a specialized financial investigations unit that operated with far more discretion than any public agency ever did. He had assisted Marcus Vale directly during the original investigation into Renwell's finances, working quietly behind the scenes to gather the kind of evidence that could not simply be argued away. When Marcus disappeared, the same forces responsible turned their attention toward Darius, framing him for a data breach he had never committed, destroying his professional reputation with the efficiency of people who had done this before. His career ended. His name became radioactive in every circle where he had once been respected. Rather than fight a battle he could not win from the outside, he chose to disappear as well, and years later, he returned to Renwell, under a uniform. Nobody would ever think to question, not seeking revenge, but searching patiently for the proof that would one day matter. He was not a man who needed to announce his own competence. He rarely spoke more than necessary, watching instead, remembering instead, cataloging the small details that most people never noticed were even there, and acting only when the moment demanded it, and not a second before. "How long have you been watching me?" Celeste asked him one night, unable to keep the question buried any longer. "I was never watching you," he answered. "Then you were protecting me," she said. "I was protecting the truth," he corrected gently, and the distinction mattered to him more than she initially understood. Together, they uncovered a hidden account buried deep inside the company's financial architecture, one directly tied to Gideon Cross. But the account itself had been opened under Celeste's own name. The implications settled over her like a physical weight. Someone was not simply trying to remove her from power. Someone was building the case that would make her, personally, the criminal at the center of the entire scandal. Her phone buzzed that same night with a message that offered no warmth and no warning. "Tomorrow, the board will remove you." Moments later, every system inside Renwell's headquarters went dark at once. The blackout hit the entire building without mercy. Every camera fell silent, every automated door locked itself shut, and Celeste and Darius found themselves trapped together in the sublevel that housed the company's oldest servers. Darius realized almost immediately what was happening, that somewhere in the darkness, a program was systematically erasing years of stored data before anyone could stop it. Celeste wanted to call the authorities immediately, her instinct for control screaming at her to bring in outside force. Darius stopped her with a single sentence. "If you call them right now," he said, "everything we need will already be gone by the time they arrive." Instead, they had to move, together, through a service corridor, toward a backup server that might still hold what remained of the truth. There was no gunfire in that corridor, no dramatic physical struggle, only the low mechanical hum of a building holding its breath. The tension came from somewhere quieter and more insidious, from the ticking clock, from the locked doors ahead of them, from data disappearing bite by bite somewhere in the dark, from the knowledge that whoever had betrayed them could appear at any bend in the hallway. Darius moved through the dark corridors with the confidence of a man who had memorized this building long before Celeste ever suspected he was capable of memorizing anything at all. He knew which panels concealed manual overrides, which doors had been wired incorrectly during a renovation years earlier and could still be forced with the right pressure applied in the right place, and which stretches of hallway sat outside the reach of the cameras, even when the cameras were working. Celeste followed him in silence, her expensive shoes useless against the concrete floor, her mind racing through every version of betrayal she could imagine, and finding that none of them prepared her for the one actually unfolding around her. Twice they heard footsteps somewhere above them, heavy and unhurried, the sound of someone who believed they had already won and felt no need to rush. Both times, Darius froze completely still, one hand raised, and waited until the sound passed before allowing them to move again. "Have you lost everything because of this?" Celeste asked him quietly as they moved through the near darkness together. "Nearly everything," he admitted. "Then why do you keep doing it?" she pressed. "Because Marcus believed that one day the truth would find its way out," Darius said. And something in the way he said it made her chest ache in a way she was not prepared for. "And you believed him?" she asked. "I believed him more than I believed myself," he answered. And for the first time that night, neither of them said anything else for a long while. They found the backup server exactly where Darius had predicted it would be, tucked behind a panel that had not been opened in years. A video file loaded onto the small emergency screen mounted above it, and the face that appeared on the display made Celeste's breath catch painfully in her throat. It was Marcus Vale, older, thinner, but unmistakably alive, staring directly into whatever camera had recorded him. "Celeste," he said, "if you are watching this, do not trust Gideon." The screen went black immediately after, and neither of them moved for several long seconds. What followed in the days after tore the last remaining illusions from Celeste's understanding of her own company. Gideon Cross, it turned out, was not the architect of the conspiracy at all, merely its most visible instrument, a loyal servant to someone far more careful and far more dangerous than he had ever pretended to be. The true mastermind was Victor Harrow, a former general counsel of Renwell Industries, a man who had spent 12 patient years constructing a hidden network of shell accounts and falsified records designed to hollow the company out from the inside while nobody was looking. Marcus had discovered the network first, and Darius had helped him try to expose it, but somewhere along the way, Celeste herself had unknowingly become the person poised to inherit control of the very system Victor Harrow had built to serve himself. The revelations kept coming. Celeste learned that her own father had known, at least in part, what Victor Harrow was building long before his death, and that the official story of his passing, a quiet illness that had taken him gently in his sleep, was not entirely the truth. His death had been managed, softened, buried beneath careful language designed to protect the company's image rather than honor the man himself. Celeste sat with that knowledge for a long time, feeling something inside her collapse quietly and without drama, the recognition that nearly everything she had built her adult life upon rested on a foundation of lies she had never been permitted to question. Darius did not try to comfort her with empty words, because he was not a man who believed comfort should ever come cheap. "You are not wrong for having trusted people," he told her instead. "But I protected them," she said bitterly, her voice thin with something close to grief. "Then protect the truth now," he answered, and it was not gentle, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. 2 days later, a formal summons arrived at her office, cold and official in its language, accusing Celeste of embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars from her own company. Every piece of manufactured evidence pointed directly at her. The trap that Victor Harrow had spent over a decade constructing had finally closed shut, and it had closed around the one person who had never known she was inside it at all. The woman who had once been the most powerful figure in the city now found herself the one being hunted. At the beginning of all of this, Celeste Wren commanded rooms simply by entering them, and Darius Bell had been invisible enough to disappear into the background of any space he occupied. Now, those roles had folded in on themselves entirely. Celeste had lost every lever of control she once held, and Darius, quiet and patient Darius, had become the only person left standing who understood exactly how to save her. The board convened for an emergency session on a gray morning, the kind of light that made every face in the room look older than it was. Gideon Cross arrived first, his expression arranged into something that resembled grief, his voice trembling with practiced sincerity, as he told the assembled directors that Celeste had betrayed the very company she had built with her own hands. The board, weary and frightened by the scale of the accusations, prepared to move forward with a vote that would strip Celeste of her position entirely. For one long moment, watching the faces around that table, Celeste felt something close to surrender settle over her, the exhaustion of a woman who had fought too many battles in too short a span of days. Then the doors opened, and Darius walked in. He was no longer wearing the gray uniform that had defined him for 3 years. He carried a thick folder under one arm, his posture calm, unhurried, entirely certain of itself. Several board members actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and one of them asked him who exactly he thought he was to interrupt a meeting of this importance. "I am the man who saved everything the rest of you tried to erase," Darius said, and the laughter in the room died as quickly as it had started. What he laid across the polished table over the next several minutes dismantled the conspiracy piece by piece. Copies of falsified transactions, each one annotated with the date it had been altered and the account it had quietly fed. Recovered server data pulled from the backup drive before it could be wiped clean, timestamps intact, impossible to dispute. The video confession, recorded by Marcus Vale, played now for a room full of people who had assumed him dead for over a decade, his voice filling the silent chamber with a certainty that made several directors visibly pale. Fabricated financial records exposed alongside the real ones they had been built to replace, laid side by side so that even the least attentive member of the board could see exactly how the numbers had been quietly bent over the years. A documented history of money quietly moved through the network Victor Harrow had spent years constructing, routed through shell accounts with names too generic to raise suspicion on their own, but damning once traced back to their source. And finally, clear evidence that Gideon Cross had spent months manipulating the board itself, feeding them selective information designed to turn them against the very woman they were meant to serve, complete with internal messages he had clearly never expected anyone to recover. One director, an older man who had sat on the board longer than almost anyone else in the room, rose halfway from his chair and asked, in a voice thinner than his usual tone, whether any of this could actually be verified. Darius answered without hesitation that every document in front of them had already been forwarded to independent auditors and to federal investigators before the meeting had even begun, a fact that visibly rattled more than one person seated at that table. Nobody in the room laughed at him again after that. Gideon's composure shattered in front of everyone. He stared at Darius, with something between fury and disbelief written plainly across his face. "I thought you were dead," he said, and the words landed with the weight of a confession all on their own. The room fell utterly silent. Celeste turned to look at Darius fully for the first time since he had entered, and in that moment she finally understood the shape of what he was. He was not simply a witness to the conspiracy that had tried to consume her company. He was the one piece of evidence, living and breathing, that every guilty party in that room had believed they had successfully erased from history. Darius placed one final folder on the table, his hand resting on top of it for a moment before he spoke again. "You forgot one thing," he said, looking directly at Gideon. "I never deleted the copy." The truth that unraveled after that morning finished rebuilding the story from its foundation upward. Marcus Vale, it turned out, had never truly died at all. He had lived under a different identity for over a decade, sacrificing his old name, his old life, and every relationship he had once held, all so that the evidence he carried could survive long enough to matter. But Darius was not Marcus, and had never claimed to be. Darius was the man who had helped Marcus disappear in the first place, the one person trusted enough to carry both the burden and the proof through all the years that followed. There was a quieter part of Darius's history that emerged during those same difficult days, one that explained the exhaustion that sometimes moved behind his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He had been married once, before everything fell apart, in a life that felt now like it belonged to someone else entirely. The marriage had not survived the years he spent being hunted for a crime he never committed, and somewhere in the wreckage of that collapse, he had become a father, raising a child largely on his own. That part of his life stayed mostly in the shadows of the story, mentioned only enough to explain why a man with his skills had ultimately chosen a life of quiet anonymity over a return to power or visibility. He had once possessed a career, a reputation, a family, and a future that seemed assured. And he had lost nearly all of it in service of a promise made to a man everyone believed was already gone. And yet he had kept that promise anyway, year after silent year, without ever asking anything in return. "Why did you never tell me who you were?" Celeste asked him, once the dust from the board meeting had finally begun to settle. "Because you did not need to know who I was," he answered simply. "Then what did I need?" she asked. "You needed to know the truth," he said. And it was, in the end, the only thing he had ever truly offered her. It was Marcus himself who walked through the door next, older than the photographs Celeste remembered, his hair grayer, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent 12 years pretending to be someone else, but unmistakably himself, unmistakably alive. She stood frozen for a long moment, unable to reconcile the ghost in front of her with the grief she had carried for over a decade. A grief that had shaped decisions she made without ever realizing his absence was still steering her hand. He looked at her with something between apology and relief written across his face. "I am sorry you had to live so long inside a lie," he told her quietly, and for a moment neither of them said anything else at all. He explained, once the silence finally broke, that he had spent those years working odd jobs under a different name in 3 different cities, never staying anywhere long enough to be recognized, never trusting a phone line or an email account enough to reach out, even when the temptation grew unbearable. He told her he had watched from a distance as she rebuilt her life around a version of him that was a traitor, and that the hardest part of disappearing had never been the loneliness of it, but the knowledge that his silence was allowing a lie about his own character to calcify into fact. Celeste listened to all of it with her arms wrapped around herself, absorbing a decade of grief that suddenly had nowhere left to go. Celeste finally turned back toward Darius, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know he was alive this entire time?" she asked. And Darius, for the first time since she had met him, said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, an answer. In the weeks that followed, the last remnants of the conspiracy were dismantled piece by careful piece. Gideon Cross and Victor Harrow were formally exposed, their falsified records and hidden accounts handed over to investigators who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who finally had everything they needed to build an ironclad case. Both men resigned their positions before the news broke publicly, though resignation did little to protect them. Once the investigators finished their work, and formal charges followed not long after, the board of Renwell Industries was restructured from the ground up, old loyalties replaced with new scrutiny, new committees formed specifically to audit the kind of hidden financial structures that had nearly destroyed the company from within, and Marcus Vale's name was formally cleared of every accusation that had once destroyed his life and reputation, a correction that arrived 12 years too late, but arrived nonetheless. Celeste stood before the press herself, refusing to let anyone else speak on her behalf, and told the truth plainly, without the polish her public relations team had always insisted upon. "I built my empire on top of truths that other people decided to hide from me," she told the cameras. And the sentence traveled further than any carefully crafted statement ever could have. She announced in the same breath that Renwell would be rebuilt from its foundation, with a transparency the company had never truly practiced before. Celeste offered Darius an official position soon after, the title of Chief Security and Integrity Officer, a role built specifically around everything he had already proven himself capable of doing. He declined almost before she finished the sentence. "I do not want a title," he told her. "Then what do you want?" she asked, genuinely curious for the first time in longer than she could remember. "A job where I do not have to pretend to be someone else," he said, and something in his voice made her smile despite everything they had just survived together. She offered him a different arrangement instead, a position as an independent advisor to the company, free from the politics and performance that came with any formal title. He agreed to that, and only that. A month passed before the story reached its final, quiet resolution. Darius walked into the Renwell headquarters one ordinary morning, no longer dressed in the gray uniform that had once made him invisible to everyone around him. He was not wearing an expensive suit either. Nothing that announced wealth or status the way so many of the executives around him seemed determined to display at every opportunity. He wore a simple, well-fitted suit, understated in every way that mattered, and walked through the lobby the same way he always had, without hurry, without performance. The same marble floors he had once polished on his knees now carried his footsteps as an advisor whose name appeared on documents that shaped decisions across the entire company. Employees who had once looked straight through him now rose from their desks as he passed. One of them offered him a warm greeting, calling him Mr. Bell, with a respect that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier, a woman who had walked past him 100 times without ever learning his name. He paused for a moment, looked around at the space that had once defined every limit of his visibility, and simply returned a greeting in kind, nothing more. He did not need the recognition the way some men might have craved it after years of being overlooked. What mattered to him, though he rarely said it aloud, was simpler than recognition. The quiet certainty that the truth he had carried for so long no longer depended on him alone to survive. Later that same day, he found Celeste standing near the window of her office, watching the city stretch out beneath her, the way she often did when she needed to think. She asked him, without turning around, whether he ever regretted the choice to save her, given everything it had cost him over the years. "No," he said simply. "Even though it cost you nearly everything," she pressed, still watching the skyline rather than his face. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I did not lose everything," he said finally. She turned to look at him then, waiting. "I still have the truth," he told her, and there was nothing more he needed to add. Celeste stood there for a long moment, studying the man who had once been dismissed by an entire building full of people who never thought to look at him twice. The man the world had labeled a janitor and nothing more, who had, in truth, been the only person patient enough and brave enough to carry the weight of a truth that everyone else had chosen to bury. She understood, finally, that the greatest danger she had ever faced had never come from a stranger in the shadows, but from the people who had stood closest to her for years, smiling while they quietly built the machinery of her downfall. And the only person willing to speak the truth aloud, in a building full of powerful people who had every reason to silence him, was the one man that nobody in that building had ever bothered to listen to at all.